Well, I think what impacts Trump is the narrative. I think the argument is being made in the propaganda campaign in the West that not only is the drone war, which you described, working very well, but also the Russians are in deep trouble on the battlefield. In effect, the Ukrainians have turned the tide and, if not just stymied, have not just stymied the Russians, but beginning to push them back in particular places. So it's not just the drone war, it's also what's happening on the battlefield. And then I think the third dimension in the propaganda campaign is to make the argument that the Russian economy is hurting badly and Putin is becoming increasingly unpopular, and it's not clear that he can remain in office. So if we keep up the drone campaign and we continue to help Ukraine on the battlefield, that will in effect topple Putin at some point, do damage to the Russian economy, and in effect will knock the Russians out of the ranks of the great powers. You remember early in the war, in the first year of the war, 2022, the Americans occasionally talked openly about delivering a significant defeat to Russia and knocking it out of the ranks of the great powers. And you actually see that kind of rhetoric coming back. And I think the Americans are once again making the argument that sanctions provide a magic tool for damaging Russia. Not just drones, but sanctions as well. And as you know well, Lindsey Graham and Richard Blumenthal, two senators, had long been pushing a new sanctions bill against Russia. And it looks like that bill, although it's been watered down a bit, is likely to pass the Senate. And Trump has said that he likes the bill. And this is a bill that's designed to cripple the Russian economy. Just very important to understand that. We're back to aiming to cripple the Russian economy. And Trump endorses the bill. And you have to marry that to what's going on in this drone war. It's quite clear that the Europeans believe that they can help Ukraine win the drone war, the long-range drone war, not the drone war on the battlefield so much. But they can give huge numbers of drones to the Ukrainians and help the Ukrainians build up their industrial capability to produce drones. And that will allow Ukraine to inflict serious damage on the Russian economy and on Russian military capabilities. That's the story they tell. So I think what's happening here is that the West, to include the United States, is ramping up the pressure on Russia because they think they're winning the war. Now, I want to be very clear. I think if you look at what's happening on the battlefield, and I think the battlefield is what really matters, I think the Russians are winning. They're rolling back the Ukrainians. The Ukrainian army is in desperate straits. The only thing that's really keeping it going is the presence of drones. I think there's no question about that on the battlefield. But it's not clear that the Russians won't ultimately overwhelm the Ukrainian forces because they're stretched so thin. So I think on the battlefield, which matters the most, the Russians are winning. But there's no question that we're back to sanctions, and we think that this drone campaign, this long-range drone campaign, can have a significant effect on the Russian economy and on Putin's standing.
Yeah, well, I saw, I think it was today, von der Leyen, she was making the statement that they now have an agreement between the EU and Ukraine for co-producing drones. And it seems also like an effort to have the EU make more long-range drones to attack deep inside Russia and, well, essentially say, well, we're not transferring drones, we're not participating, these are, Ukrainian-made. But it kind of begs the question because, where this is all going. Because the Russians are looking at to what extent the West is involved in this. And, it's a difficult question to answer because there's a lack of evidence. There's a lot of war propaganda out there. On the other hand, it's very hard to imagine, especially the drone attacks on St. Petersburg, that they weren't, being assisted by NATO to attack. But what do we actually know about NATO's involvement in these attacks on Russia?
Well, let me come at this from a slightly different angle than I usually approach the subject. I believe that one of the principal reasons that the Russians attacked Ukraine in February of 2022 is they believed, quite correctly, I think, that Ukraine was becoming a de facto member of NATO. Now, if you fast forward to the present, I think that what's happening here is, and you can hear it in the rhetoric from people in the West, that Ukraine has gone to great lengths to, in effect, become not only a de facto member of NATO, but a de facto member of the EU. And it's very important to understand that the EU has become a more militarized institution since the war started in February of 2022. So when Ukraine works overtime to become a de facto member of NATO and a de facto member of the EU, what that means is that you have an intermingling, a coming together of Ukrainian military capabilities, Ukrainian intelligence, and Western intelligence, and the ability to build weapons. I mean, Trump said that he was going to grant the Ukrainians a license to build Patriot missiles inside of Ukraine. Just think about what this means. This is just another way of saying Ukraine is becoming a de facto member of NATO, a de facto member of the EU. It's being integrated into the West militarily. And again, at the same time, what's happening here is we're going back to sanctions in a big way with this Blumenthal-Graham bill. And we have the drone campaign, the long-range drone campaign. So I think from Russia's point of view, it is very clear that the West is joined together with Ukraine, even if Ukraine is not a formal member of the EU or a formal member of NATO, and that it is the West, to include the United States now, and Ukraine, that is waging war against Russia. And I think if you listen to the Russians speak, they are in effect saying that is the case. They understand what's going on. You and I are not the only two people on the planet who have figured this out. So the question the Russians face is, what do they do about this? And that what they do about it is a function of two factors. Number one, how serious is the threat? How serious is the threat of new sanctions? How serious is the problem of a long-range drone campaign against the Sea of Azov, against the Black Sea, against Crimea, against Moscow, and so forth and so on? How serious is that threat? And then the question is, what are the targets that the Russians can hit in Europe to bring an end to this close coordination between the Europeans on one hand and the Ukrainians on the other hand? It's not obvious what the Russians can do to break the growing link between Ukraine and the West. And this, of course, segues into the whole Sergei Karaganov argument about what Russia should do in the face of this threat. But the point I'm making to you, Glenn, just to encapsulate my argument, is that Ukraine and the West are growing closer and closer together. The West is becoming more invested in the Ukraine war than it ever has been. And from the Russian point of view, it's quite clear that what the West and Ukraine together want to do is they want to defeat Russia. And the question is, how can Russia avoid that outcome?
Yeah, well, I have to say now, yeah, from Moscow as well, that they see now the diplomacy with the US as being essentially nonsense, while with the Europeans there's no diplomacy at all. And as you said, I think there's a good understanding now that NATO's waging a war on Russia. But given this problem that is Ukraine and Europe or even NATO are growing closer and closer together, how do you think this will impact the Russian, I guess, objectives for what the end of the war will look like? Because again, the Russians invaded in 2022 to decouple Ukraine from the NATO alliance because they see this as an existential threat. Does this increase then or expand the demands in war? Do they need more territory? I saw Putin, he made a reference to liberating Novorossiya, and that's a very different piece of territory. Now you're talking Nikolaev, you're talking Odessa, you're talking Kharkov. I mean, this is very different territorial ambition. Is this where they're headed, given that there is no diplomatic path? There's no willingness to even talk to Russia from the European. From where the Europeans are, but also, as you said, if they're getting closer and closer, any deal that comes with a promise of Ukrainian neutrality, I would assume it wouldn't be worth much, because as we've seen now with the war on Iran, we can sign any documents we want, we're not actually going to implement them. So how do you think the war objectives of Russia is changing, given that the West is wedding itself so closely now to Ukraine?
Well, I've long argued that this war will eventually end with Russia conquering a large slice of Ukrainian territory, and Ukraine coming out of this conflict as a dysfunctional rump state. Now, the key question that is raised by your comments is, how much territory will the Russians take, and how dysfunctional and how small will that rump state be? The more the war goes on, and the closer the relationship between the Europeans and the Americans on one side and the Ukrainians on the other side is, the closeness of that relationship will affect how the Russians think about taking territory and how dysfunctional they want that rump state to be. I think, given what's happening, the Russians have a vested interest in taking much more territory than the 4 oblasts they've already annexed. And I think they certainly want to take Odessa, and they want to make sure, that Ukraine has no ports on the Black Sea. And moreover, they want to make sure that Ukraine is as dysfunctional a rump state as possible. The more dysfunctional Ukraine is, the better. This is why people like you and I have argued for a long time the Ukrainians should have cut a deal with the Russians, accepted the fact that they have to be a neutral state, and then done everything to improve relations with Russia so that they minimized how dysfunctional Ukraine turned out to be. But that's not the direction that this conflict is going in. And given the pressure that's being put on the Russians, and given that the Ukrainians in the West want to win the war, want to knock the Russians out of the ranks of the great powers, the Russians have a deep-seated interest in wrecking Ukraine as much as they can, taking as much territory as they can. So I think that's where the incentive structure is today for the Russians. But the big question that you have to ask yourself is, do the Russians have the capability to take a lot more territory. As you and I both know very well, as everybody knows very well, the Russians have had a devil of a time conquering all of the territory in those 4 oblasts that they annexed. They've really only conquered all of the territory in one of the 4 oblasts, although they do control a huge amount of territory in the other 3, but they don't control all the territory. So the question is, once they do capture all the territory in those 4 oblasts, will they then have the military capability to take more territory, to take Kharkiv, to take Odessa, at some reasonable cost? And I think at this point in time, it's hard to be certain what the answer is to that question. So that's the capability side of the story. But going back to the incentives, there's no question that they have a powerful incentive to do everything they can to wreck Ukraine and take as much territory as they can absorb.
Yeah, well, certainly the violence have escalated, though. It appears that they're using much more powerful weapons now, and hitting a lot more targets as well. But I wanted to pivot a bit back to the war with Iran, because I think that the Russians, as well as the Chinese and even the Iranians, were a bit surprised by their success against the United States, because well, the US is immensely powerful, and one would have assumed that the Iranians wouldn't have come out on top. At least this was the assumption for many people. So how do you explain this? How can the US lose this war, essentially?
Well, let me just say that I think before the war started, if you go back to February 27th, the day before the war started, I think almost everybody thought that the Iranians would do reasonably well, but hardly anybody thought that they would do as well as they have done. I think the Iranians themselves are surprised by how well they have done. I'm surprised. I mean, I thought all along the Iranians would do very well. I thought they would shut the Strait of Hormuz, but I did not fully appreciate how well Iran would do in the fighting. Now, what's going on here? I think there's sort of 2 dimensions. One is the Strait of Hormuz. They have shut the Strait of Hormuz, and the United States has been unable to alter that situation. The United States, despite all Trump's rhetoric, has not been able to reopen the strait. And it's quite clear that Iran is now going to control the strait forever. And I don't think anybody fully appreciated just how extensive Iran's ability would be to shut down the strait, and how neutralized the Americans would be in the process. So I think that's point one. I think the more important point in terms of why we were surprised has to do with missiles. I think going back to the 12-day war in June of 2025, this is when Iran fought against the United States and Israel in a short 12-day war. It was quite clear then that Iranian missiles were quite effective, but the war was quite short. It was only 12 days, and the propaganda in the West was sufficient to disguise the fact that those ballistic missiles that the Iranians had were deadly effective. And of course, after the 12-day war in June 2025, the Iranians learned lessons, and they went out and they improved their ballistic missile capability, and they improved their drone capability. So when the war started on February 28th, the Iranians had a huge arsenal of ballistic missiles and drones, and those ballistic missiles were deadly accurate and had high explosive warheads. So they could do an enormous amount of damage. And what we have discovered as the war has worn on, and here I'm talking about the war that started on February 28th, is that the Iranian missile capability and drone capability gives them a significant advantage over the United States and Israel in this war. This is why we stopped the air war after 40 days. This is why we can't win the tit for tat campaign. You know, if you listen to the Americans and their Gulf allies talk, it seems like they shoot down every incoming Iranian ballistic missile and knock down every Iranian drone, and hardly any of those Iranian weapons get through to the target. But there's enough footage coming out now that makes it clear that this is not true, and that the Iranians are pounding Bahrain, pounding Kuwait, pounding Jordan, and so forth and so on. This Iranian missile capability is truly awesome. And you marry that to their drone capability, and you see that the Iranians are in a position where they have more coercive leverage over us than we have over them. And I don't think that people fully appreciated that before the war. I mean, we knew, again, from the 12-day war last year that those Iranian ballistic missiles were quite formidable. But I don't think we fully appreciated just how formidable that inventory of Iranian missiles and drones really is. And we have now found out. So I think what's really allowed the Iranians to do so well against the Americans and against the Israelis is, number one, the fact that they control the Strait of Hormuz, and we can't take that control away from them. And number two, they have this truly impressive arsenal of drones and ballistic missiles.